All right. We are back. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Wishing you a good and erev Shabbos. Shabbos begins tonight. We're still in Sukkot. Today's Hoshana Rabbah, day of huge rejoicing. And tonight begins another holiday, Shmini Atzeret. We just got it firing on all cylinders. And now we're back after an aborted attempt. Seems like Facebook was down. I thought, is there something wrong with me or my computer? But I went to Down Detector and I saw, complaints that Facebook is down spike from like 400 complaints when I tuned in the first time to 9,000 complaints just a few minutes later. But it seems that Facebook is back. We've got the show up and running, and today's gonna be a barnstormer. So many incidents that we're gonna cover, and it's a double daf. We're gonna cover 2 pages today. Lots to do. I wish you could have seen that. The candle fell off and it landed upright on the ground. Woohoo! So much going on. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely Friday? Oh, I think did it bend a little bit? I'll have to fix that later. Ugh. Okay, we'll see. Anyway, who's with us today? Yehudit is with us from Florence, South Carolina. Joan from Albany. Bonnie from Mississippi. Joyce from Amsterdam. Welcome, Joyce. Paula from Chicago. Don from California. Mark from Portland, Oregon. Randy from Florida. Maria says Simchas Torah is coming and Shavua Tov. Simchas Torah is on Sunday. Although if you're in Israel, I guess it's tonight because it coincides with Shmini Atzeret. Brian Bowen from San Francisco. Deb from California. Joyce is asking us to please explain the chatzeiros reshus in towns like Amsterdam that have an eruv and a lot of non-Jews. We're not going to quite get into that today. Chaim saying good Shabbos, and Meggie Lynn from Ostrander, Ohio. June from North Carolina. Jeffrey from Hayward, California. Brenda from Yuma in Arizona. Fred says hi. Ruby says shalom. Robert with us from Galloway. Diana saying good afternoon. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie with us from Georgia. Excuse me. Marasia with us from Georgia as well. And Lindsay saying shalom, and let's do it. Amen. Let's do it. So much to cover today. That music was Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Efrat in the Holy Land. That is his Nigun Neshama, a tune originally composed by Shlomo Carlebach. All right. Like I said, so much to do. Where are we holding? We're in Tractate Eruvin, 3rd volume of the Talmud. We're going to finish our discussion of chapter 5 today. That means we're going to complete our discussion of the 5th Mishnah and the 6th Mishnah and the 7th Mishnah. And we are on, where are we? We're on Daf Samech. So this is pages 60 and 61. 2 pages today, double Daf. That's actually going to get us caught up so that we're on the Daf Yomi schedule with the rest of the world. But then we're going to fall a page behind immediately since I won't be with you on Saturday night. We have a 2-day holiday here outside of Israel. Shmini Atzeret begins tonight and Simchas Torah begins Saturday night. So I'll be back with you, God willing, Sunday night. Today, the 7th day of Sukkot, is a special day. It's Hoshana Rabbah. It's a day on which we can work and carry and walk and turn lights on and off and cook, etc. But it's still a very special day. In some communities, like so festive. Normally, I would have been in temple all morning, probably with Yehuda Solomon singing our brains out with a big community. But okay, COVID, God willing, that kind of Hoshana Rabbah will be back next year. But today, is special. It's when we daven, when we pray for all the rain that should come in the coming year. May we receive a generous and kind decree from God above that all the rain that is needed will come this year and all the communities will have what to eat. Okay. So, this chapter, the fifth Mishnah of chapter 5, remember we wandered off a little bit. The general topic of chapter 5 is about the Shabbos boundary and moving the Shabbos boundary and establishing the Shabbos boundary and measuring the Shabbos boundary, meaning how far we can walk on Shabbos. Establishing that for cities, right? So if your dwelling is in a city, it's like the whole city is your dwelling, and you measure the 2,000 cubits that you can walk on Shabbos, the maximum that you can walk away from your dwelling. We measure it from the limits, the city limits of the city in which your dwelling resides, and you get 2,000 cubits in any direction from the city limits, subject to the shape of the city and measuring from the corner of a square city, etc. But the fifth Mishnah, we actually return to the subject of joining courtyards. That's not about how far we can walk. It's about whether or not we can carry in a certain area. We can carry objects that are permitted to touch on Shabbos within a public domain, within a private domain, not in the public domain. We can't transfer objects from a private domain to a public domain on Shabbos, but we can join private domains together. It's called joining courtyards, and we can actually join whole neighborhoods and make a big community-wide eruv for carrying purposes. Why is that subject coming up here in chapter 5? Because it's citywide considerations, just like the citywide considerations we've been having earlier in this chapter. All right, so let's finish up our discussion of this fifth Mishnah, which is about joining courtyards. All right. If at the end of a public domain that's within a city, right? So within a city, if we find a ladder at the end of the public domain, the question, and then that leads into a courtyard of a private domain. The question is, does the ladder at the end of this? So imagine a public thoroughfare, right? Like a busy street, and it ends in a dead end. And then there's a ladder that you can go over the wall at that dead end and get into a private courtyard. So the question is, does the ladder at the end of this public thoroughfare, which then would connect us if we go up the ladder and over the wall and into a private courtyard, is that ladder going to function as an entrance to that courtyard? And so the public thoroughfare is connected to the private courtyard. Or does the ladder function as a partition? Meaning if the ladder wasn't there, it would just be the wall. The wall is a partition. So is the ladder really just part of the wall and it's just a partition? Or does it function as an entrance? Rabbah said in the name of Rav, it's an entrance. The fact that there's a ladder makes it quite different than if there was no ladder. So we can say that there is a connection now from the public thoroughfare into that private courtyard. Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav Ada, in the name of Rav, no, that's not what Rav said. Right? You're misunderstanding. Rav said that it's an entrance sometimes and it's a partition at other times. It's not that a ladder always functions as an entrance. When isn't it an entrance? Okay, in this situation, yes, if there's a ladder, according to Rav, if there's a ladder at the end of this public domain and then you could use it to cross into the private courtyard, it's going to act as an entrance. But if there are two private courtyards separated by a wall and they have a ladder, at that wall so you could go over the wall from either side to the other, is it an entrance? Is it that those two courtyards are considered to be linked by that ladder? Rav said they have a choice. If they want to join in an eruv together, they want to join those two private courtyards together so one can carry from one courtyard to the other using the ladder, they may do so. And if they don't want to join the courtyards by way of that ladder, they can choose not to. This is important, this idea that they have a choice. because when two courtyards really open into each other, as we've seen that case of the inner and outer courtyard yesterday, it can happen that if people don't join in the eruv who have access to the courtyard, maybe because they forgot or because they chose not to, that can actually end up preventing the people in the other courtyard from carrying on Shabbos in their own courtyard, right? So it's an important difference. Rav says the latter in this case might be an entrance, might not. They have a choice. So then the Gemara objects, wait a minute. Didn't Rav Nachman say in the name of Shmuel that a ladder which connects a balcony to a courtyard makes them joined, right? So if you've got a courtyard with a few houses in it, and in that courtyard there's a ladder up to a balcony, so according to Shmuel, now that balcony is part of this courtyard. The people who live in that balcony or in the apartment that's attached to the balcony, they need to join with the other residents in that courtyard in the eruv. If they exclude themselves for some reason or they were forgotten, now they can walk through the courtyard, but they're not allowed to carry because they didn't join in the eruv. And if somebody has access to the courtyard, has rights in the courtyard, right, a balcony that's connected to it with a ladder, and they're not part of the eruv, it's problematic. They're not allowed to carry, and that can end up prohibiting even the other residents of the courtyard who did join in the eruv from carrying in that courtyard on Shabbos. So says Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, in that situation where the ladder joins the courtyard up to the balcony, they're going to prohibit people from and they're not part of the eruv, they're going to prohibit the other members from carrying unless there's a partition. So we clearly and definitively separate the balcony from the courtyard by erecting a partition. The ladder is there, but we could put a partition at the top of the ladder and say, okay, they're separated. They're clearly separated. They can close their door and not be part of this courtyard. In terms of the access through the ladder, I'm not sure exactly how they're dealing with that. But if there's a partition, okay, then they're separated and they're not going to prohibit the people from carrying that are down below. The Gemara comments, you've misunderstood the case. It's not like that at all. Actually, it's not a ladder going up to a balcony like you can imagine on the second floor. Rather, it's just a very short ladder, like a few steps, and it joins a balcony which is within 10 handbreadths of the courtyard floor. In other words, it's really part of the courtyard, right? It's just they're a little bit elevated, but as we've seen, something that is within 10 handbreadths of the ground is considered like it's on the ground in terms of being part of the same domain. So since it really is part of the same domain, they're residents of the same courtyard like everybody else, and they need to have a firm partition separating them from the courtyard in order that they don't prohibit everyone else from carrying there on Shabbos, since they didn't join in the eruv. And that's that case. Then we have, this is a colorful story, a nice colorful incident. The residents, and today we're going to have a couple of colorful incidents, right, where we're going to take these rules, which seem kind of complicated and technical, and we have to really work to understand them. And we're going to have a couple of stories of where the sages needed to apply these rules and what actually happened. So here's the first one. The residents of Kakunya, am I pronouncing that right? I'm not sure. If somebody hears me saying it wrong, let me know. The residents of Kakunya wanted an eruv for their city. Okay, so they have a city, they want an eruv. Now, this particular city is a city that dwindled in size over time. Originally, it was a public city, kind of a major city. People moved away, it became smaller, and now it was a private city. As we've seen, the situation of a public city that became a private city, it may have a citywide eruv for purposes of carrying on Shabbos, but they have to exclude some part of that city, even the remaining smaller private city. Some part of it needs to be excluded from the citywide eruv so that as we learned in the Mishna here, the Mishna number 5, that the people don't forget the laws of eruv, right? They don't come to just kind of forget it. Yeah, well, our city has an eruv, and we'd have to know the rules of how eruv works. Some small part of the city has to be excluded from the citywide eruv so that people will be conscious of, oh, okay, there's an eruv we can carry throughout the city except for that area, and we can see how that area is separated from the rest of the city. Do they have their own eruv? How is that being handled? Those are other questions, but people will be, led to ask those questions since it's not a completely citywide eruv. The fact that there's an excluded area will serve as a teaching principle for all the residents of that city. Okay, so the residents of Kakunya, this formerly public city that became a private city, they want an eruv for the whole city, and they understand that some little part of the city is going to need to be excluded. It's complicated. They don't consider that they are expert enough in this field of law, so they go to Rav Yosef, a big sage at the time. This is in Bavel, right, in Babylonia, the Jewish community in Babylonia. So they go to a major sage of their general area, their region, and they say, we'd like to build an eruv. Can you please do it for us? Rav Yosef sends his student, Abaye. So this is a young Abaye. Abaye, as he gets older, will become a major sage in his own right. But right now, he's a student of Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, go, establish the eruv in Kakunya, and make sure that you do so in such a way that there will be no outcry in the study hall. In other words, do a good job, because people will be watching closely. And as you know, this is a community where there's a lot of, very educated scholars who, if you make a mistake, they'll find the mistake and point it out and raise objections in the study hall. Okay, Abaye understands the challenge. He goes to Kakunya. So the first question is, he understands this was a public city that became a private city. Some little part of it is going to need to be excluded. Yesterday, somebody asked the excellent question, okay, well, you have to exclude some part of the city. Which part are you going to exclude? I mean, it's definitely going to be detrimental to the residents of that small area that they're in a separate eruv and they can't freely, mingle with the rest of the city like everybody else can. So who is going to get excluded? So Abaye's first thought is, there's an area of the city that sort of offers up a natural, section to be excluded from the citywide eruv. Namely, there's the whole city laid out, and it's on a river or near a river, and there's a part on a river, and there's a part of the city that's kind of walled off from the rest of the city, but open to the river, right? So these houses open onto the river and walled off from the rest of the city, fully walled off. So he said, okay, well, that's perfect. Let's make that the excluded area. And by the way, we also had the question yesterday, would the residents of an island need an eruv? Aren't they naturally enclosed? I have to do more research on it, but my initial research says depends. If they're surrounded by a beach, where the wall, the sort of so-called wall around their eruv, the partition, is one where the ocean can deposit sediment, and so the actual line can move back and forth, that won't work. But if you're on an island that has cliffs that could really function as a wall, those cliffs are big enough and separating the residents of the island from their outskirts, that would work. Okay, so here we have this section of Kakunya that's walled off from the rest of the city, opens onto the river. Unclear if the shoreline of the river is good enough to function as a wall for their own eruv, but that's not our question right now. The question right now is, will this work as the excluded area so that the rest of the city has a viable citywide eruv? Abaye thinks, okay, they're naturally disconnected. That's going to be the excluded eruv. But then Abaye thinks to himself, wait a minute. This is a problem. We're going to exclude an area from the citywide eruv. When we say exclude, we mean that there's an area of the city that would have naturally been part of the citywide eruv, and we are going to delineate how it's going to be excluded. This walled off section of the city that has a wall surrounding it, I don't know, maybe it's a really fancy neighborhood and they don't want to have any contact with the rest of the city and they're going to get in and out of their section through some special gate only at the river's edge, or maybe even taking boats out. I don't know how they're connecting to the rest of the city, but they have a solid wall between them and the city. So Abaye thinks, you know what? They can't be in an eruv with the rest of the city. They are fully excluded physically. They're physically excluded from the rest of the city. So they couldn't join in an eruv with the rest of the city if they wanted to. They have to have a separate eruv if they're going to have an eruv at all. And therefore, we can't use them as the excluded area because they didn't have the choice to join in the first place. So this isn't going to work. So Abaye says to himself, well, how am I going to make it work? We'll make openings in the wall. He says windows, but really it means openings so that there's a real connection between this area that he seeks to exclude and the rest of the city. So it's not going to require windows in the wall that separates them from the rest of the city. Then it should work. But then Abaye says to himself, wait a minute. We don't need windows because we have the example of Mechoza. In Mechoza, which is another city in Babylonia, the sage Rabba bar Avu made an eruv for them, taking advantage of the fact that the various neighborhoods in Mechoza were all separated from each other. They had these ditches of water that separated the various neighborhoods, and they were fully separated, right? So the fact is, those neighborhoods wouldn't be able to join together in an eruv in the same way that this walled-off section of Kakunya wouldn't work. The various neighborhoods in Pumbedisa also couldn't join. They're physically separated by these ditches. And when Rabba bar Ava made the citywide eruv for carrying on Shabbos in Mechoza, what he said was, we need excluded areas, but all these neighborhoods, it's like they're excluded from each other, so the neighborhoods will serve as the excluded area, one for another, and that way we can make the citywide eruv neighborhood by neighborhood. They're all in it, but they all act as the excluded areas for each other. The actual effective result of that is that everyone is included in the citywide eruv, and this requirement of excluding a neighborhood is fulfilled. It's kind of weird. They're all in the eruv, but they act as excluded areas from each other. So we can do that here. And then Abaye thinks to himself, no, that's not going to work, because even though they have the ditches, they can connect via the rooftops. Now, I'm having a little trouble picturing that, but I'm guessing what he means is even though they had ditches at the ground level, maybe at the rooftop level, they were close enough to each other, or they maybe even had some kind of bridges, bridging the rooftops across the ditches. In any case, those neighborhoods, via the rooftops, were more connected to each other than this walled off section of Kakunya is connected to the rest of Kakunya. So the example of Mechoza, not going to work for this case that Abaye is facing before him. Okay, so in that case, maybe we can look to the example of Pumbedisa, thinks Abaye. Now in Pumbedisa, they made a citywide eruv, and they fulfilled the requirement of having an excluded area by saying this very large warehouse, which is filled with straw, is going to function as the excluded area. You can't carry in the warehouse that's filled with straw. And then it's like, wait a minute, but that's the same as our original issue. A warehouse full of straw can't join in an eruv because it's not a residential area. You can't use this industrial warehouse as you can't connect. You can't make that part of an eruv. You can't join in an eruv because it's not a residential section. And yet they were able to use it as the excluded area. It must be that there's some doubt of whether such a structure is residential in nature or not, so there's some possibility that it could join in the eruv, and since the law of eruv is generally lenient, since it's instituted by the rabbis, they were lenient in that case, and therefore I can be lenient in this case, and I can use the excluded area in Kakunya as the excluded area to justify the citywide eruv, and I don't have to make windows in their wall. Case closed. And I'm going to be able to defend that in the study hall when all the objectors and haters come and hate and object. And then Abaye says to himself, now I see why Rav Yosef said to me, be very careful and deliberate and don't reach any hasty conclusions, because voices will arise to challenge me, and I need to be prepared to be able to defend the logic by which I reached my conclusions to set up the citywide eruv and fulfill the obligation to leave an area of it excluded. Boom. Abaye. So the takeaway there is he ended up in the first place that he started. But by going through that whole process, comparing to other precedents, other cities, how did they do it, other sages, how did they establish it, he himself became much more cognizant of the law and how he arrived at it. And maybe there won't be an outcry, maybe there will, but if there is, he's prepared to defend it. And there's no way he would have been in that position if he just went and applied the law as it seemed to him, to fit in the first case, right? Good lesson there for all of us when we're making decisions that affect a lot of people, even if the law is positively clear to us, and not just the law, Jewish law. I mean, this could also be in a workplace, right? You're going to make a policy that's going to affect a lot of people. And you know that your policy is within, the U.S. law and the state law and the city law and the various regulations and the workplace laws and rules that have already been established by management. Even though it's all clear to you that you can do what you're going to do, you should still check with a bunch of people, go on the listening campaign, make sure that everything makes sense here, let everybody speak, see that there's other rules that you may not have thought of. And at the end of the day, by going through that process, it's going to be much more firmly established than if you didn't. Even if you end up in the same place, there's value in going through that process. Okay. Right. So, what about the excluded area? Now let's talk about, okay, so we excluded some area of a city in order to fulfill this obligation of one area has to be excluded. Okay, so that area, can they have an eruv for themselves? Absolutely. Do they need to exclude part of their smaller eruv in order to fulfill the same obligation of leaving an area excluded so that the laws of eruv won't be forgotten from this community? Answer, well, they're excluded from the big area. They function as the excluded area. And the big area functions as the excluded area for the benefit of the smaller area, right? They can say, well, that the rest of the city is excluded from our eruv, so that is definitely satisfied. But then the question comes up, well, what about a very small city? What about a very small city? Do they really have to leave out an area of their citywide eruv in order to fulfill this obligation? I mean, if the city is small enough, then it's going to be, now the excluded area is going to be maybe a large part of what's left. And so they discussed this back and forth for a while, and ultimately, Rabbi Shimon says the first answer was that it should be this area the size of Hadasha, where 50 residents lived. But what if you're talking about Hadasha itself? What do they have to exclude? Or a small city that has 50 residents, what do they have to leave excluded in order for this to function? Right? This is in the case of a public city that dwindled and became much smaller, and they do have that requirement to exclude some part of the city. So Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's enough if you exclude an area which has at least 3 courtyards of 2 houses each. And Rabbi Yitzhak says, no, you don't even need 3 courtyards of 2 houses each. It's enough if you exclude 1 courtyard that has 1 house in it. then okay, something is excluded from the citywide eruv, you fulfilled your obligation. Abaye asks Rav Yosef, Abaye asked Rav Yosef, this ruling of Rabbi Yitzchak that leaving just one courtyard with one house is enough of an excluded area. Did he come up with that according to his own logic? Did Rabbi Yitzchak come up with his own logic to justify that? Or did he have a tradition that he received from his teachers? And Rav Yosef says to Abaye, what difference does it make? Rabbi Yitzchak is a Tana, and we can rely on his ruling, whether it comes from his logic or from a tradition that he received. And Abaye answers Rav Yosef just as we would expect, given what he learned from the process of going through all that thinking, as Rav Yosef told him to make sure to go through that process. Now Abaye says to Rav Yosef, is Talmud study a song? Meaning, are these just lyrics that we learn and memorize and recite? Or do we have to understand where these rulings come from so that we're aware of their internal logic and we can apply them in novel situations where we're not sure what to do? Obviously, it's not a song. It's not just lyrics to memorize. We do need to understand where the rulings come from. And since this discussion ends there, we get the sense that Rav Yosef said, good job, good student. You're absolutely right. We do need to know. Now we go to Mishnah number 6. We're getting back into discussions of the Shabbos boundary. Now we're getting away from the laws of carrying on Shabbos, Eruvin, chatzeiros, and back to the laws of how far we can walk and how we establish the Shabbos boundary around a city. Eruvin techumin, right? To the techum. The techum is the boundary of a city, how far we can, it's the boundary of how far we can walk on Shabbos. In the case of a city, if the dwelling is in the city, we measure the techum, the 2,000 cubits that we're allowed to walk from the city limit. Okay. So let's read this Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 5. One who was to the east of his home when Shabbos began, and he said to his son before Shabbos, establish an eruv for me to the west. Or if he was to the west of his home, and he said to his son, establish an eruv for me to the east. The halacha is as follows. If there is a distance of 2,000 cubits from his current location to his house, and the distance to his eruv is greater than this, he is permitted to walk to his house, and from there he may walk 2,000 cubits in every direction, but it is prohibited for him to walk to the spot where his son deposited the eruv. On the other hand, if the distance from one's current location to his eruv is 2,000 cubits, and the distance to his house is greater than this, he is prohibited from walking to his house, and he is permitted to walk to the spot of his eruv, and from there he may walk 2,000 cubits in every direction. In other words, with regard to the Shabbos limit, one's place of residence for Shabbos cannot be more than 2,000 cubits from his physical location when Shabbos begins. Let's break that down pretty quick. Was there more? Oh, I'm sorry. There's one little piece to the Mishnah. And one who places his eruv in the outskirts of the city, i.e. within an area slightly more than 70 cubits surrounding the city, i.e. within the area of about 70 cubits surrounding the city, it is as though he has not done anything. The 2,000 cubits of one's Shabbos limit are still measured from the edge of the outskirts of the city, even if there is no eruv, and one therefore gains nothing from placing an eruv within this area. If, however, he placed his eruv outside the city's boundary, even if he only placed it 1 cubit beyond the city, what he gains in distance through his eruv on one side of the city, he loses on the other side. That is going to need some explanation. So, the basic principles that we're establishing with this Mishnah are, first of all, when we talk about placing an eruv, let's just remember that the way the language is being used here in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, an eruv, right, is a sort of area where we're going to establish certain rules. But the word also refers to a basket of food or a position where you're establishing your Shabbos dwelling, right? Where you place your eruv is where you place that basket of food with 2 meals. That's going to establish your Shabbos dwelling. That's going to be your dwelling for Shabbos. If your dwelling either because it's your house where you live, or it's the place where you're staying for Shabbos, like you traveled and you're staying at someone's house for Shabbos, or you take a basket of food with 2 meals worth of food and you put it somewhere before Shabbos, intending that this should be now considered as your Shabbos dwelling, so that becomes your Shabbos dwelling. Or you make an eruv with your feet, meaning that at the time that Shabbos is beginning, you go and stand in a certain place for the purpose of making that place your Shabbos dwelling for the rest of Shabbos. And you would do any of these things because you'd move your dwelling because you want to walk further in that direction than 2,000 cubits. So you're going to establish your dwelling before Shabbos begins, or as Shabbos is beginning if you do with your feet, in that direction, a certain distance, so that you can travel further that way once Shabbos starts. And you're going to lose the ability to travel in that direction by as much as you move your dwelling that way. All of this is modulated by the issue, the principle we've already established, that if your dwelling is in a city, so you get the whole city as if it's your dwelling. Right? You can walk throughout the city, and then how much further you can walk on Shabbos is 2,000 cubits from the city limit. That's what we've been talking about a lot in this chapter. So they're saying the outskirts of the city is like an extra 70 cubits beyond what we would consider the city limit. So if you place your eruv there, your basket of food, in the outskirts of the city, you haven't done anything because you already had the city limits as you're still in the city. So in other words, if you change your Shabbos dwelling from one place in the city to some other place in the city, you haven't done anything because you get the whole city as your dwelling as long as you're within the city. However, if you place your eruv, your basket of food, a little bit outside the city, meaning outside the city limit, it is no longer in the city, it's just outside the city. Okay then. Now your dwelling for Shabbos is wherever you placed that basket of food, and you get to go 2,000 cubits farther than it. But you can lose quite a bit in the other direction. You don't lose the same amount that you gain. Since, let's just say that my notebook here, let's just say that this is the city, right? So let's say my house is here. It doesn't matter where my house is, anywhere my dwelling is, I get 2,000 cubits from the edge of the city. Now let's say I deposit my basket of food here, just a little bit outside the city. Okay, so I can go 2,000 cubits in that direction and 2,000 cubits in this direction, right? I no longer get all of the city. I only get that part of the city which happens to be within 2,000 cubits of where I deposited that basket of food. So if this city, for example, is much more than 2,000 cubits, let's say this is a big city, and the 2,000 cubits from my basket of food would end here. Now I can no longer even access this part of the city, because as we've learned, when one is measuring from a dwelling, the dwelling is no longer in the city. Even if the 2,000 cubit limit ends in the middle of a city, that's where your limit is, and you don't get to access that part of the city anymore. I might do that anyway if I needed to reach a place that was a little bit more than 2,000 cubits from the edge of the city. So I might move my dwelling to here just so that I can get to that place. Okay. And what we saw is in terms of when you're establishing your Shabbos dwelling, you can't establish it more than 2,000 cubits from where you are when Shabbos begins. Because if you put that dwelling further away than you could reach on Shabbos, well, then you're outside your techum to begin with, and you would be, confined to your 4 cubits. You wouldn't be able to go anywhere. So if you try to establish an eruv, meaning deposit your basket of food in a spot that's more than 2,000 cubits from where you are when Shabbos begins, so that you can't reach this Shabbos dwelling that you tried to establish, well, then you established an error, it's invalid, and you don't get that as your Shabbos dwelling. That's what this Mishna is teaching us. I said that. I said that. Okay, now the title of our show today is Beware of Drunk Gederians on Shabbos. So this now is the story, the incident, the curious case of two cities on a hillside, Geder and Chamtan. Okay, so Geder and Chamtan, and there's just a little bit of a illustration here. So there's Geder and Chamtan on a hill. Geder is the uphill city. Chamtan is the downhill city. Okay. Interestingly, these two cities, like let's say the center of the upper city, Geder, compared to the center of even the city limit, the houses that are at the edge of the city, of the upper city, are a little bit more than 2,000 cubits away from the city limit of the lower city, Chamtan, right, where the edge of the houses, where the houses end. There's no wall around these cities, okay? So the city limit is simply measured by, where the houses end up, right, where the edges of where the last house is, okay? On the lowest house of the upper city and the highest house of the lower city, those are the city edges, and they're more than 2,000 cubits apart. So it would seem that on Shabbos, the people from these two cities can't walk to each other's cities. It would seem that way. However, the people on the upper city in Geder, they live on quite a steep slope. The slope is so steep that they built a safety wall below their city. And it's a little bit of a distance away from the lowest house of the city. Now, the safety wall is more than 4 cubits high, and it just makes people feel more secure, like they're not going to roll down this very steep hill. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi ruled that this lower safety wall, right, which is downhill of that upper city, is going to count as their city limit for the purposes of their measuring, okay? And what that means is that the residents of Geder, of Geder, the residents of Geder, are able to walk down into the lower city of Chamtan, but the residents of Chamtan are not going to be allowed to walk on Shabbos uphill and into Geder, because they're measuring from their houses, from the last house. They don't make it into Geder. But since the people of Geder are measuring from their safety wall, they can, within 2,000 cubits, make it into the town of Chamtan. Now, why is this worth note? So the first question is, okay, so is that a general rule? If you have this safety wall, that counts as your city limit? Is that true? Is that wall like surrounding Geder? No. Is it like the whole lower part of Geder? I'm not sure. Maybe it's only along the road. Maybe it's only part of the area. Is this a general rule that we can rely on, that there's such a safety wall on a steep hill, when there's a town on a steep hill, that we can measure from there? Not clear. Maybe yes, maybe no, because there are other extenuating circumstances. Turns out that the people of these two towns, particularly the people of Geder, have a personality. They have a reputation, and it's not a good one. The reputation of the people of Geder is that they're bullies. They're kind of mean, they're bullies. And they've been known to assault the citizens, the residents of Chamtan, when the residents of Chamtan are up in Geder visiting. It's dangerous for people of Chamtan to visit Geder. Possibly the ones in Geder are not Jewish and the ones in Chamtan are. A little bit unclear. But if they're talking about who can measure to walk, that doesn't make sense. There must be Jews in both towns because these laws don't apply to non-Jews. So I'm not sure why that interpretation was written in the book. So let's just assume everybody's Jewish, but the ones at the top there, they just tend to bully the ones in the lower town. Okay, So why would we want them to end up going into the lower town at all? Wouldn't it be better they could just be separate? They shouldn't mix at all. Well, first of all, if mixing is an issue, why are we only talking about Shabbos? Should we make some kind of a decree that the people of these two towns should just never mix, not the 6 other days of the week as well? Well, apparently they have the reputation that on Shabbos in Geder they drink a lot, and then they become more bullyish and violent and dangerous. So the issue really does become more important on Shabbos. Okay. If that's the case, now we understand why we don't want the people of Chamtan up in Geder on Shabbos, because they could get assaulted. But why should we let the people of Geder walk down to Chamtan? And there we hear that, a dog is not as bold outside of its yard. In other words, the people in Geder will start fights with people from Chamtan when they're in Geder. But when they're down in Chamtan, they're not so bold. They don't walk around starting fights when they're outside their own town. Well, but shouldn't then we be concerned that the people of Chamtan, who had to put up with these Geder bullies all the time, now they get a few of the Gederians alone in their own town, maybe they'll assault the Gederians. And then we're not worried about that, because the Gederians, while they might not start the fight when they're outside their own town, they certainly will defend themselves, right? So in light of all these extenuating circumstances, we can see that Rebbe instituted this law that maybe is a general principle for a hillside town that has a protective wall beneath it and we can measure the techum from there. Or maybe he instituted that law for this locale, given all of these, sort of public policy considerations, and we shouldn't extract, a general principle from this situation. Okay. And that's that. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. And now we're going to have a short discussion of Mishnah number 7, which is going to conclude chapter 5. It's going to conclude this 2-page double daf show that we're having as we're heading into Shabbos and a holiday. So if you've got comments or questions, get them in now. I'm going to come to them momentarily. Okay, Mishnah number 7. I'm just going to read it, and we're going to have a quick discussion, and then we're going to go to comments and questions. Mishnah number 7. The residents of a large city may walk through an entire small city, and the residents of a small city may walk through an entire large city, even if part of it is located more than 2,000 cubits from their city. How so? One who was in a large city and placed his eruv in a small city, or one who was in a small city and placed his eruv in a large city, may walk through the entire city in which he placed his eruv, and another 2,000 cubits beyond it, as the entire city is considered as though it were only 4 cubits. Rabbi Akiva says, no, he has only 2,000 cubits from the place of his eruv, and the actual area of the city is included in the calculation. Rabbi Akiva said to the rabbis, do you concede to me that one who places his eruv in a cave has only 2,000 cubits from the place of his eruv, and that consequently the entire cave is not considered as merely 4 cubits? And the rabbi said to him, well, when does this apply? When the cave has no residence. But if the cave has residence, it is considered as though it were only 4 cubits, and one may walk throughout all of the cave and then gets 2,000 cubits beyond it. Consequently, the halacha, the law, with regard to an eruv placed inside a cave is sometimes more lenient than the law governing an eruv placed in the area above the cave on the ground. And if one places his eruv inside a cave that has residence, he has 2,000 cubits beyond the cave. And as for one who is measuring his Shabbos limit, with regard to whom the sages said that one gives him 2,000 cubits, that measurement applies even if the end of the measurement terminates in the middle of a cave. He may not walk further into the cave, even if the cave is inhabited. What we're looking at, the same thing that I was saying to you before. If your Shabbos dwelling is inside a city, and this is a city, anywhere where your dwelling might be, you get to walk all around the city as if it's your dwelling, and then you get 2,000 cubits beyond the city. That also applies if you actually live out here. You live out here, but you established before Shabbos began that your dwelling would be in the city. This is a very smart thing to do, unless you needed to go further up here. But as long as you wanted to walk around the city, Okay, so you're here. Let's say that the city's big. It's maybe 8,000 cubits across. You live out here. You establish your dwelling in the city. Now you get the whole city to roam around in, plus 2,000 cubits in any direction because your dwelling's in the city. Even though your house is up here, you established before Shabbos that your dwelling would be in the city, so you get the whole city. If you didn't do that, if your dwelling, your house is up here, so you get 2,000 cubits in any direction, even if your 2,000 cubits ends in the middle of the city, that's where it ends. You don't get to walk all around the city. Rabbi Akiva was bringing the example of a cave, and he said, we all agree that if you are measuring into a cave and your 2,000 cubits ends in the cave, that you only get to walk as far as your 2,000 cubits. What if you put your dwelling in the cave? Your Shabbos dwelling, you establish it in the cave. Do you get, and now this is a cave, imagine it's a cave. Do you get to walk all around the cave? According to Rabbi Akiva, no you don't. You only get 2,000 cubits from your dwelling. The rabbis who dispute Rabbi Akiva said, no. If the cave has people who live in it, it's a residential area, then just like a city, if you put your dwelling in the cave, you get to walk all around the cave and 2,000 cubits beyond it as well. But if the cave is uninhabited, if it's desolate, and really what it means is uninhabitable, right? Because sometimes if we say if it has residents or people could live there, that's good enough, and you get the whole cave to roam around in as long as you establish your dwelling in the cave. But if the cave is not inhabitable, it doesn't have that potential to be a residential cave, then it's just like if you establish your dwelling somewhere outside of a city and you get 2,000 cubits from wherever that dwelling is, and that's it. And so we don't think of the cave as one sort of residential area the way we do a whole city. It would just be like putting your eruv, your deposit of food, somewhere out in the countryside, and you would get 2,000 cubits in any direction from where you put that basket of food. So that general principle, we measure 2,000 cubits from a dwelling. If the dwelling is in a city, we measure 2,000 cubits from the edges of the city. If that dwelling is placed in a cave, if it's an inhabitable cave, you get to roam the whole cave, and then you get 2,000 cubits from the edges of the cave. And that's generally speaking going to apply to any spot where you leave your eruv. If it is uninhabitable, whether it's a cave or some other kind of situation, you put it on a cliff, in a tree, whatever, you're going to get just 2,000 cubits from where you deposited. You're not going to get any immediate surroundings as if it were a dwelling in a city. And that's it. Okay, let me come to comments and questions, if any. Pam Simmons. A person must put much thought into where the basket is placed. Because of the area of the city, you may be prohibited to travel and access. What if an emergency arises? Is travel and access permitted then? Even in modern times, can prohibited areas be accessed in case of emergency? Answer, in case of emergency, to save a life, all these rules go out the window. If the emergency is a matter of life and death, we don't worry about eruv, we don't worry about carrying, we don't worry about turning lights on and off or starting cars. We do anything that's necessary to save a life. If the emergency is not of a life and death nature, okay, the question would require further analysis. Let's see. Lynn is surprised by Rav Dimi that on the Sabbath, drunkenness is more common, and so Geder gets rowdier and more dangerous toward assault. If they do not guard this, why would they bother with a Shabbos techum? It's a great question, right? If they're not controlling themselves to the point where they're going to be becoming drunk and become more dangerous, maybe what we're talking about, don't think about hooligans in a soccer stadium, that kind of drunken rowdiness, but rather, they're just people with big personalities, and when they get a little bit inebriated as they're wont to do on Shabbos. The personalities get even a little bigger, but it's not like they're gonna, just go and violate all of the rabbinic ordinances, right? It's just a matter of degree. That is what we're talking about here. I don't know the situation so well that I can, speculate effectively, but I'm guessing somehow the policy is worth making, right? Because we definitely have had that teaching elsewhere that the sages will not institute a decree that people are going to ignore, because that lowers respect for the sages and diminishes Torah generally. So Rebbe had to have reason to believe, and good reason to believe, that people would follow this decree. So if he's taking into account the fact that they tend to drink more on Shabbos and become a little bit more rowdy, as it were, but they're not going to be so rowdy when they're outside of their own town. So it's just they drink a little more, they become a little bit rowdier, but they're not becoming crazy and dangerous, seems to me. All right. If you're still with us, you've done great. We covered a lot of material today. We did 2 pages 60 and 61 in Tractate Eruvin. We completed chapter 5. I will not be teaching tomorrow night, Saturday night, because we'll be between holidays, Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah. God willing, I'll be back with you Sunday night, and we're going to open a new chapter, chapter 6. There's going to be some beautiful material there, a whole bunch of wisdom teachings in addition to the technical stuff. And we have a lot to look forward to. My friends, my pals, I bless you that this season of our rejoicing, which began all the way back in Elul, at the beginning of Elul, when we started preparing for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, continued through the days of awe, when we were in such an elevated state. We were trembling, we were examining our deeds, but we also had a joy because we know we have, all of us as children of God, have a special relationship with our Father in heaven. And so we can count on him to be fair and merciful with us. And then Yom Kippur ended, and we built our sukkahs, and we entered that beautiful liminal state where, it's sort of like we're half in heaven and half here, and we're living in these temporary residences that kind of signify the fragile new us, right? As we're trying to make resolutions that stick, coming out of that period of examining our deeds and atoning for our sins and wanting to do better in the new year. And now we've been in our sukkah all week during the week of Sukkot. And today, Hoshana Rabbah, we're davening for plentiful rain in the coming year, physically, so that all the crops should be watered and we'll all have what to eat, but also spiritually, thinking about our parnasa, our livelihood for the coming year. Today's a big, big day to daven for your livelihood, to pray for your livelihood in the coming year. And now we enter Shabbos and Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, and then the holiday season finally comes to an end. Though some say it'll continue even into Hanukkah a month and a half later. But basically the holiday season ends this weekend, and may this whole period, this festival and feast and season of rejoicing, be a blessing to you and all your loved ones.